tonight I mainly want to talk more about the context of the sutra, where it fits in terms of the Buddha's teachings, and a bit about the structure and a bit about the main topic before we actually go into the sutra itself. So, given that the sutra is coming from the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, I would like to start this session encouraging everyone to generate a particular type of attitude or motivation for listening to these teachings. And in Buddhist lingo, we call that the mind of enlightenment, or bodhicitta. And that is the intention that may I, by listening to these teachings and then putting them into practice, may I be able to free all beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. And so with that intention, we can get started here. So when I say the context and kind of where it fits in, what I mean by that is that the Buddha, Shakyamuni, he didn't just teach one thing and say this is the truth and everyone has to come in line with this truth. The Buddha taught many different things which accorded with the level of the person in front of him. So according to the historical narrative of the Buddha's life, he himself was a prince of a small kingdom and ended up renouncing his kingdom and going off in the quest for a spiritual path, seeking to go beyond the sufferings of this world. And in that, his first levels of practice that he went through with his own teachers, who were, in modern speaking, we might use the word Hindu, but the word Hindu is a very modern word. It doesn't really mean that much other than a Indian spiritual tradition, technically speaking. So anyway, this is a pre-Buddhist Indian spiritual tradition, and he learned the practice of shamatha, or calm abiding meditation. And as the story goes, he had two main teachers, Rinpoche and Lakyap, and they took him through as far as they could take him, essentially. So with his first teacher, he made it so far and made such fast progress through these stages of calm abiding meditation that his teacher told him, there's nothing else I can teach you, you need to go on. And he sent him on to the next teacher to say, you've reached the level that I'm at, so I can't take you any further. And then when the Buddha went to the next teacher, a similar situation happened, but he still wasn't happy with his attainment because he felt like that though he had attained a very deep calm, a very steep stillness of mind, that still wasn't liberation. That still wasn't this ultimate level of attainment. So then the Buddha left, again, this second teacher. Actually, he was begged to stay on because that teacher was old and he wanted him to actually take over as the teacher in that community. But the Buddha thought, no, that this is still not what I was looking for. I still haven't become liberated in this more ultimate sense, meaning that he hadn't gone beyond, I'm trying not to use too much technical language here, but had not gone beyond a cycle of dissatisfaction, that he had just maybe muted or dulled the experience of suffering through deep states of calm and peace that one could attain through shamatha, or calm abiding meditation, but hadn't actually uprooted the source of suffering. So he went on and continued meditating by himself, and the story goes that he practiced very austere practices, eating very little, wearing very few clothes, practicing for 6 years along a river called the Naranjana River. And then at one point he gave up his austerity. He found that depriving himself of nourishment and sleep and so forth was actually causing a hindrance. So a young woman named Sujata brought him, as the story goes, some rice porridge or some milk porridge. Different accounts translate that term differently, but at any rate brought him some food. And he ate more solid, more significant amounts of food for the first time and felt very nourished and felt very alive and vital. And then went to, as the story goes, the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening. Sat under this tree and in the evening kind of broke through, you could say, saw through to the deeper level of reality that he had been seeking and cut the root of suffering ultimately and attained complete and perfect enlightenment. And so the reality that he saw in that moment under the Bodhi tree is exactly the explicit topic being talked about in the Heart Sutra, which is, using Buddhist language, it is the profound truth of emptiness. So the Heart Sutra is a quite famous text, and I think it's mostly famous because it's short and easy to recite, not because most of the people that are reading it actually understand what they're reciting, because it's actually extremely difficult to understand, because the Buddha in this sutra does not even explain what emptiness means. He just says things are empty. What I mean by that is that there are a lot of other sutras of this same category, category meaning that this sutra is called the Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom. The Perfection of Wisdom is a whole category of teachings in the Buddhist canon. And I would encourage you all at some point to explore the website 84000.co. So this is a newer, I'm going to post a link actually to the Heart Sutra translation at 84000.co in the chat right now, if you want to look in your chat right now. There's also going to be a link to that sent in the follow-up email, but this is a website which is free translations. There's a project that's been going on for, I don't want to say exactly how many years, 10, 15 years, something like that, under the auspices of Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche, to translate the entire canon of the Buddhist teachings, which in Tibetan is called the Kengyur, which means the translated teachings or the translated words of the Buddha, which is over 100 volumes of text. And in that, the Prajnaparamita, or the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, are a pretty big chunk. I mean, they're not a huge chunk massive wise, but like in terms of like one particular category of sutras, they're maybe the biggest one in the entire collected works of the Buddha. So this sutra is, 2 pages, but the longest of them, which is called, in Tibetan they just call it Bum, which means 100,000, but it means the Prajnaparamita, or the Perfection of Wisdom, in 100,000 lines. It's massive, like multiple books, multiple volumes of text. So in those longer versions, so there's the 100,000 line Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, the 20,000 line Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, the 8,000 line Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, the 300 line Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, which is also called the Diamond Sutra or the Diamond Cutter Sutra in some translations. And then there's a slightly more abridged one than that, and then there's the Heart Sutra, and then even more abridged than that, there's the Perfection of Wisdom in 1 syllable. So just the syllable "ah" is supposed to represent, the entirety of the teachings of emptiness, of the entire express reality itself, you could say. So the reason why I'm saying that the Heart Sutra is very popular but very difficult to understand is because what is happening in the Heart Sutra is everything that was explained in the 100,000 or 20,000 or 8,000, where they really do talk about why and how things are empty, why and how the nature of reality is like this or that, is trying to condense all of that meaning into something very short that you could memorize and recite. So for someone who has already studied a lot and has already trained in or meditated on emptiness to a large degree, just reciting this text can be very meaningful, really refreshing their experience, or their refreshing their memory, or refreshing their awareness in that moment of the fullness of the truth of emptiness. But to someone who has never read a Buddhist text, or who's never read or studied or meditated upon the teachings about emptiness or selflessness, it might read like some kind of nihilistic manifesto that makes no sense at all. That's why this actually requires quite a bit of explanation. So I don't even hope that in these 3 sessions I will be able to communicate the full experience of what's being talked about here to you. I hope that these 3 sessions can be a starting point in your own journey of exploring the Heart Sutra, and give you a good foothold in how to do that and how to start your own exploration. I can say for myself, I first read the Heart Sutra probably 25 years ago. And I used to practice in a Japanese Zen center under a really wonderful Japanese master named Shohaku Akumura Roshi. And we would recite the Heart Sutra every day. I was a quite active member at the Zendo. And at the time, I think I had some vague ideas about what we were reciting, and I maybe heard a little bit of teachings here and there. But now, 25 years later, I'm still learning more about the Heart Sutra. I'm still deepening my understanding and experience of the teachings of emptiness. Of course, if I hadn't, I would already be enlightened, and I'm obviously not enlightened. So So today, like I said, I want to give a little bit more context about what does the word emptiness mean. Why would you ever even want to go into something called emptiness? I mean, that sounds quite vacuous and quite maybe sad or dark, just as a term. I'm assuming there are quite a lot of you in this audience tonight who already have some understanding and experience of the truth of emptiness. But for those of you who are totally new to this, I also want to provide some context. When I was saying before that this sutra teaches or shows explicitly what the Buddha experienced in his moment of awakening, that is one way of talking about what we call teachings of definitive meaning. There are these categories amongst the Buddhist teachings called provisional teachings or definitive teachings. And a way of talking about what those might mean is a definitive teaching is what is experienced by a noble being, an Arya being, a noble Arya. These terms mean, it's a little bit of technical Buddhist jargon for you, but someone who has had a direct experience of reality, meaning that it's no longer through some kind of concept, through the lens of a concept or through some kind of logical or inferential reasoning. Like for me, for example, when I want to think about emptiness, I have to think about why things are empty, which means I'm not seeing emptiness directly. Between me and understanding emptiness, there's still some like thought pattern or an idea of emptiness appearing in my mind. I'm not seeing it directly the way that I see this computer in front of me directly. Like between me and my vision of the computer, there is no mental concept, there's no mental image, there is just a direct experience. So someone who has had that kind of direct experience of the truth of emptiness is called a noble being, or an Arya being in Sanskrit. So definitive meaning teaching means what does a Buddha or an Arya being see in their meditative equipoise, when they are sitting in their meditation and experiencing emptiness directly. A sutra that just expresses that is called a definitive meaning sutra. Anything else that talks about the existence of, for example, in a lot of the other sutras, they talk about karmic cause and result. They talk about generosity. They talk about ethics. They talk about discipline, patience, and so forth. Those are all called provisional meaning teachings because they are true in their context, but they are spoken for the purpose of leading you towards an experience, a direct experience of reality. So they're not ultimately true, you could say. And so then, even in, for example, in The Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva, some of you may be familiar with that text, there is a quote in that where he says, all of these branches the Buddha taught them for the sake of wisdom. And what that line means is that all of the first 5 of the 6 perfections, which are generosity, ethical discipline, patience, diligence, and meditative concentration, all 5 of those are not ends, you could say, in and of themselves. Like you can't get enlightened just by being generous. You can't get enlightened just by being diligent. You can't get enlightened just by having perfect conduct or perfect ethics. But those things are going to lead you to a state and create the causes and conditions within which you could have this direct experience of reality. So, what's the point of so-called experiencing reality? So the Buddha's teachings, the Buddha says of his own teachings that my teachings are ones that liberate by seeing. What does that mean? To see what? And what is it that we don't see normally? That's the important question when we're going to talk about emptiness. And I'm saying that noble beings see this and that. The Buddha saw this and that. So, according to Buddhism, the reason why we experience suffering is because we are not experiencing things as they are. We are ignorant, you could say, of reality. And because we're ignorant of reality, we see things that are actually, in fact, impermanent as permanent. We see things that are, in fact, lacking any kind of intrinsic identity as solid and singular, as having some kind of intrinsic reality or intrinsic existence. We see things that are actually a multiplicity or that are made up of all kinds of parts, and we think of them as solid and singular. And because of these kinds of ignorance, these kinds of misseeing, then we are over-exaggerating what's actually there. And when we do that, for example, when I see something which is in fact impermanent, but I believe it to be permanent, maybe not even intellectually, but I'm reacting to it as if it were permanent, then what happens then is when the situation changes, or when I change, I feel a lot of pain and suffering because it's going against my expectation. It's going against my habit of way of seeing or experiencing things. Also, when I overestimate what is there, for example, Ken Rinpoche often gives a simple example like that. To the extent to which you are fixated on something, your reactions to that thing or situation are going to be magnified. So for example, he talks about, like, if someone gave me, let's say a really good friend of mine gave me just this glass. And I have, because of that, I have a lot of, I've kind of superimposed, you could say, or placed a lot of importance onto this glass. And then when this glass breaks, I'm going to be really upset about it. But if I had this exact same glass, another one, but it's not the one my friend gave me, and it broke, I may be upset, but I'm not going to be upset to that same extent. And, I know that's not displaying the ignorance aspect of the reality, but it is talking about how when we superimpose meaning onto things, to the extent to which we are fixated to that is to the extent to which we will have an emotional reaction towards that situation. So that's just an illustration of that. But our type of fixation that this kind of seeing reality, you could say, will overcome is on our fundamental way of experiencing not only our sense of self, but everything that we interact with, anything that could be an object of our mind or experience. So, when we meditate, now I'm going to come around a little bit to how the Buddha taught in terms of a progression of what topics people meditate on, and what that has to do with who was receiving the teaching of the Heart Sutra. So I hope I'm making sense here and not getting too off track. Because I said at the very beginning, the Buddha didn't just teach one thing. He taught many different things according to who was in front of him. So this topic of emptiness was not the first thing he taught, and it was not something he taught to people who were total beginners. And I also want to say that I am hoping that I can communicate this in a successful way, and also hoping that all of you, I think because Western people and people with a modern education have a lot more analytic and scientific thinking as a bit of a foundation through going through an education system, the teachings about emptiness aren't so shocking. In the old days, where a kind of systematic education that brought in critical thinking and so forth wasn't so prevalent, it's said that sometimes when people heard teachings about emptiness, they got terrified and ran away. And because of that, within the Buddhist teachings, there is something called bodhisattva vows. And so as someone who is deeper into the practice, at some point one may choose to, this is not something you have to do, one may choose to take certain commitments to reinforce their commitment to the practice and to enhance their conduct, to enhance their practice, to support their practice in another way by taking certain commitments. One of those levels of commitment is called the bodhisattva vows. One of those bodhisattva vows says, do not teach emptiness to those who are not ready to hear it. So I'm very much hoping that no one here gets terrified and wants to run away and gets a wrong view of Buddhism or gets a nihilistic view and gets really depressed. So I'm really hoping that we have a good, skillful communication here, a good exchange. If anything is not clear or is leading you to have doubts, please ask and let's clear that up. So I got off track there. Let's come back around to how do these teachings begin or how did the Buddha first start teaching this idea of emptiness? So instead of using the word emptiness, in the early stages of the Buddha's teachings, he taught about selflessness, speaking from the absence of a truly, permanently, independently existing me or I. So after the Buddha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, the story continues that he said, I've experienced something which is profound, peaceful, free from conceptual elaborations, luminous and uncompounded. It's a nectar-like Dharma that no matter who I taught it to, I don't think they would understand. So I think I should just remain alone in the forest. That's what he said after he attained enlightenment. And then the story goes that some of the Indian gods, Indra and Brahma, came to him and they begged him to teach. Oh, please, you've realized something really profound and special. You have to share it with the world. And eventually he decided to teach. So there's his first teachings happened in a place called Sarnath, which is very close to modern-day Varanasi, India. And there he taught a teaching called the Four Noble Truths. I'm not going to get too in-depth about what the Four Noble Truths are, but I'll just list them off. They are the truth of suffering, the truth of the origins of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path. And so the truth of suffering is just explaining all the different ways in which we suffer and experience dissatisfaction. The truth of the origin of suffering is showing that our karma, which is created through this ignorance, and our afflictive emotions, which arise because of that ignorance, then are what cause us to suffer, what cause us to experience dissatisfaction. The third noble truth, the truth of cessation, is the truth that doesn't always have to be the case. You actually could stop that cycle. Like the Buddha did himself, you could also end your cycle of suffering or dissatisfaction. So to do that, you have to do something, right? It's not just going to happen all on its own. So there is the truth of the path. So the path includes all the different stages of meditation, Buddhist ethics, provisional and definitive teachings, as I mentioned before, all kinds of things. But what is included in this teaching, in terms of the stages of the path, there's something called, I'm not going to get into this too much, but there's something called the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. And one of the teachings within that is the truth of selflessness. So when we talk about selflessness, what the Buddha taught is that essentially that what we think of as me or I is an idea that we have based upon 5 things. And those 5 things in Buddhist lingo are called the 5 aggregates. And the reason that they are called aggregates is that they themselves are also not singular and solid things. They're also just collections of other things. And sometimes this is called the view of the transitory collection, this view of the self. The reason is because what we have actually is a collection of things, a body and different states of mind and emotions. They're constantly changing. But in our mind, we think, me, that's me. And our mind apprehends that me as if it is always and has always been like that. What I mean by that is I myself am 44 years old. So I was born 44 years ago. And ever since I was born, and ever since I learned my name, I thought, that's me, I'm Justin. And in my mind, there is some kind of innate fixation that thinks that always has been me, and there is some eternal thing called Justin that has been carrying on through space and time from 44 years ago up to now. But when we investigate what that is, there is a body which has been changing every moment to moment, on a cellular level. If we look through the lens of modern science, just through Buddhism, we just say that nothing remains for a second instant, according to the momentariness or subtle impermanence teachings, that everything's changing moment to moment to moment. So the me that I thought I was even a moment ago, the body, has already changed. It's fresh, it's new, each moment. And then, so the first of those 5 aggregates is the aggregate of form. And those of you that are already familiar with the Heart Sutra, the very first thing that they talk about the emptiness of is form. And in that, they're talking about the form aggregate. Essentially, you can talk about this on other levels, and different commentaries do talk about this on other levels, but initially what it's talking about is your body. So, the second of those aggregates is called feeling, or you could call it sensation. It's not feeling on the level of, I feel like doing this or that. It's feeling on the level of when our minds come in contact with some object, there is a subconscious, this isn't on the level of thinking yet, there is a feeling of like, dislike, or neutrality towards that object. And that doesn't necessarily have to be an external object. That can be feelings within our own body, or like the way we interact with our own thoughts. Then, so then we have the third, which is called perceptions. And perceptions, this has all these words have very specific definitions, you could say, in Buddhist philosophy. So don't just run away with the idea of perception. It means like when we label things, when I see something and then I have an idea of what it is. So I think I'm Justin, I'm good, I'm bad, I'm the best, I'm the smartest, I'm the worst, I'm terrible. All of those are perceptions. Then there's something called conditioning factors. Essentially, what this is talking about is, on a simple level, if I just try to be really straightforward and not get into a full-blown conversation about the 5 aggregates, it means our emotions. So when I see an object, or when I see a person, and seeing that person or object, I would say that the main mind, or the main level of consciousness, is my visual consciousness. Like I'm looking at my friend Hannah right now. And because we're friends, when I see her, it's not just a blank vision, but there are other shades of meaning happening in that. There's like the feeling of trust. There's a feeling of like. There's a feeling of, if she was in pain and I knew that, there would be a feeling of compassion or pity or something like that. So the main mind, you could say, is the visual consciousness. The what we call mental factor, or in this case conditioning factor, is those kind of like the emotional landscape of that experience. So anyway, all of these things are components of who we think we are, how we feel, how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive of situations and things like that. The last one is called the aggregate of consciousness. And in that sense, it's really talking about our thinking mind. It can also talk about our sense consciousnesses. So all of these things are things that when we, according to Buddhism, like the definition almost of the self, is it is an imputation, it is an idea that we have based upon looking at these 5 things and thinking I, or thinking me. But when we really look and try to see, where is this I? So these are the kinds of meditations that the Buddha would teach. He would say, okay, is the Buddha, someone's sharing a screen. What's going on?
It's just empty, isn't it?
Okay, that was a funny turn. Sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. So, and for those of you who have this text or have read this text, if you look at the 9th chapter of The Way of the Bodhisattva, there are specific kind of instructions on how to meditate on this. So in that text, he says that you should look through your entire body first. And when you look through your entire body, you look through and you say, okay, these hairs on my head are not me. These teeth are not me. These eyes are not me. These arms are not me. These internal organs are not me. Okay, these feelings are not me, like and dislike. These perceptions are not me. They're actually, Ken Rinpoche's way of talking about this, Namchak Ken Rinpoche, who's one of my closest teachers and one of our main teachers here at the Namchak Foundation, he always talks about it also as that we think that we possess this, like my body, my feelings, my emotions, my perceptions, my thoughts, but where's this me that we think exists that's separate from those? Because that's how our mind actually thinks about. That's how our mind is functioning. As if there is some permanent, real, independently existing me that somehow exists above and beyond these 5 aggregates which are constantly changing. And so this was the first way that the Buddha taught emptiness, but at this moment he didn't call it emptiness. He just called it selflessness. So if one were to realize that, then what the effect would be, ultimately, if they fully realized that, is they would no longer experience suffering. Because the suffering is experienced on the basis of this misapprehension of there being some kind of independently, truly, singularly, permanently existing self. So, this is the first thing that the Buddha taught, and this is still the main object of meditation in the Theravada Buddhist tradition, is the selflessness of the person. And the reason I'm saying selflessness of a person and saying self almost twice is because we use the same word selflessness when we apply it to other things as well. And in that sense, it doesn't mean self like myself or I, but self as in an independent or self-identity, like some kind of independently existing entity. So, for someone who is themselves in a manifest state of suffering, they feel really bad and they really want to get out of that bad feeling. They really want to overcome their suffering. The first thing they should do is try to overcome this fixation on the self. So that's the first thing the Buddha taught to this group of people. Then once someone has already kind of come to a certain level of freedom for themselves through that experience, then one would move into, if this is a sequence of an individual practitioner, one might move into, at the second level, what's called the Mahayana teachings, or the Great Vehicle teachings of Buddhism. And in that, the Buddha taught in a slightly different way. Rather than just encouraging people to free themselves from suffering, free themselves from this cycle of ongoing experience of dissatisfaction. So I didn't even get into the bigger topic, which is that in Buddhism, the Buddha did talk about an ongoing cycle that transcends just this one lifetime, that people have been going through this cycle, and dying's not the end, but they will take rebirth again due to the propelling factor of this ignorance and karma. So ignorance, I guess this is worthy of a couple minutes of conversation, but I don't have a ton of time. But when we are seeing something as real in the sense of permanent, independent, singular, then our reaction or interaction with that is going to create a habit. When we see something as real and see ourselves as real, in our interaction with that, every time we react or interact with those things, we are creating habits for repeating that kind of behavior. If we are experiencing things as they are, or experiencing an absence of a self, then there is no me who's fixated or who is solidifying, or who would experience, you could say, or who would continue to create the habit. This is a little bit far out and deserves its own conversation, and I don't have time for that tonight. But essentially, according to Buddhist philosophy, as long as I'm still fixating on this I as a truly existing entity, then everything I do is creating further habits to propel me into continuing the same type of experience. And it's only when I overcome the fixation on the self that I'll stop creating karma. So I will stop creating habits, and it is the habit that keeps you stuck in the cycle. So if I do something, and I'm happy that I did it, and I believe that everything that I did is real, then it's very likely that I'm going to repeat that same type of behavior. And behavior, I'm speaking on a very coarse level. I'm also talking about very subtle habits of the mind's way of seeing and experiencing things. But for someone who fully completes this path of experiencing selflessness, they will stop creating karma. So their cycle of cyclic existence will stop, you could say. So, the Buddha said, though, that just ending your own cycle is great, but that's not as far as you could go. You could actually, instead of just stopping your own suffering, you could actually fully awaken your utmost inner potential, which is already your true nature, it is your full potential, you could awaken that to a level that is so much more beneficial than just stopping your own suffering. And that is to go to the state of full enlightenment, the state of Buddhahood. And to do that, you need a couple of factors. You need to realize not only is the self, the I, not truly existing, but neither is anything else in the entire existence, nothing that you experience. That's one factor. The other factor which is going to aid that is this attitude of bodhicitta, which is that intention to free all beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. Because if you still don't have that, there's still subtle grasping at one's own benefit, which is still a subtle level of self-fixation. If you're still thinking, this is for me, then there's still an idea of me. So part of the transcendence of the I is to expand the intention from just, I want to be happy, to, I'm going to make everyone happy. And part of it is seeing this ultimate reality that there is no truly existing I or you or anything else. So, that's why in the Heart Sutra, the first thing that they talk about isn't the absence of the self, because they're already kind of assuming that you know that. It's actually the aggregates themselves, one by one, breaking them down. The things that you even are the basis for your idea of a self, we break those down. So that's a way of going from not only seeing the absence of an independent I, but then going into the absence of even the things that make up the idea of I, the objects or components of our experience. So it'll make more sense when we apply this to the actual sutra, I think. But for now, I just want to, my main intention with this evening's talk was to get us ready to even talk about what's in the sutra. Because without this preliminary talk, for some of you who are newer to this, I'll start talking about emptiness and you're going to be like, what the heck are you even talking about? So, first of all, the same logic that we came to with the lack of an independently existing I can be applied to anything else that you see too. So let's just talk about the first one. Let's say that my body is the object, one of the objects upon which I imagine the idea of Justin. So then we look for a truly existing body, okay? Where is the truly existing body? Is it the finger? Is it this finger? Is it that finger? If I tear this whole arm off, did your idea of the body go with my arm, or does it stay in this part of the body? If you take this arm off, is there still a body? And is the body this part, or did it go into the arms, or where did it go? And so on and so forth. You have the arms of the body, the head of the body, the neck of the body, the bones of the body, the organs of the body, but where is this body that possesses all of these things? So that's the logic of emptiness. And the idea is that because we see the body as a singular entity which exists independently meaning that it's not an interdependent entity. What would it mean for it to be interdependent? Or even we could say that it only exists by way of positing. That's another way of speaking, by positing it on the basis of other things. We talk about a body when we talk about a collection of parts. So only on the basis of some collection of parts can we talk about a body. That means it's dependent. It doesn't exist in and of itself. When we look upon something, I don't even mean that we believe this on an intellectual level, because there are a lot of us who have already trained in some of these concepts, and we don't believe that things truly exist anymore, but we're still operating as if they do because we haven't overcome the habit. I don't know if that makes sense right now, but what I mean by that is you can be a smoker, know that smoking's bad for you, and keep on smoking. In the same way, you can know that everything's impermanent on an intellectual level, but keep on acting as if things are permanent and being disappointed by things when they prove to be impermanent. Those are not contradictory. And the reason is because our habit of experiencing things as if they're permanent and as if they truly exist or independently exist is so strong that just a little bit of an intellectual understanding does nothing to overcome the habit. Not nothing. It does something. It's a starting point. But it's not strong enough to overcome the habit. Just like knowing how bad cancer is, knowing how bad smoking is for you, is not strong enough, is not good enough or powerful enough to overcome the habit of smoking, something like that. So that's where meditation comes in. Mere intellectual understanding of this philosophy of selflessness or emptiness does not overturn the habit and does not create enlightenment, will not free you. It will be the starting point. In Aryadeva's 100 verses on the middle way, or 400 verses, sorry, he says that even doubting whether things are empty or not tears cyclic existence to shreds. What he means by that is that, like, normally we don't even think about it. We're just like, we just assume everything's real and keep operating on that basis. And we've been doing that, according to Buddhism, for countless lifetimes. Continually, like, going in the cycle of up and down, joys and sorrows and so forth. And then the second we even start to think, maybe it's not real. Maybe in that second, it's not enough to, like, tear everything apart, but that starts maybe the cycle of breaking it apart and maybe eventually leading to liberation. So, at any rate, I just kind of said intellectualism's not going to get you anywhere, and then I had to go back on myself and say that it will get you somewhere, but maybe not so quickly. The idea is that to actually overcome the fixations which are creating suffering, you have to meditate on their antidotes, which means if the problem is seeing from a deeper level, like an innate level or a kind of subconscious level, I'll say, seeing that things are singular when they're not actually, seeing that things are independent when they're actually interdependent, seeing that things are permanent when they're actually impermanent, those mistaken consciousnesses or those mistaken perceptions are what are creating our suffering. So to overcome the suffering, you can't just like put a Band-Aid on it and you can't just take some drugs. You have to stop it from the cause. You have to stop creating the cause of your suffering. And the cause is that mistaken perception. So to overcome the mistaken perception, you have to meditate on its opposite. You have to meditate on the reality. The reality is that things are not independently existing, that things are not permanent. And so that's the point of meditating on emptiness. So, to sum this up a little bit, because I said a lot of things there. The Buddha first meditated on calm abiding, which is just stilling the mind. He realized that just stilling the mind doesn't get you liberated from suffering. It just calms you down. It can kind of make you dull and ignore suffering, but it doesn't make you overcome suffering. Then he realized that this insight into the nature of things is what would overcome suffering. And then in the way that he taught that insight, he first taught to people, because first people have to like wish for, it's hard to wish for the enlightenment of all beings when you're still kind of like barely treading water in your own suffering. So the Buddha first taught, okay, help yourself out, okay? And these are the teachings of individual selflessness, the lack of an intrinsic I. Now, one thing I didn't say before is that I was talking from the perspective of one person's progression. One person could progress from that more individualistic, or maybe you could even say in a more pejorative way, selfish perspective. I just want to be free. Once they've attained a certain level of kind of freedom of mind themselves, it's easier for them to expand into this, okay, let's help everyone kind of vision. But there are some people who from the very beginning already have that seed of compassion. And from the very beginning, they don't need to go into the like more self-oriented level of teaching, and they can just go straight into this Mahayana approach. So that's why I say also the Buddha didn't just teach one thing, but also different people's capacities, different people's orientations will align them to feel more inclined towards Theravada Buddhism, for example, more towards Mahayana Buddhism, more towards Tantric Buddhism. All these different things has to do with one's own inclinations, one's own progress that they've made in this life or past lives. The connections that they've made in this life or past lives are going to lead them to connect with different teachings. So one really crucial thing in our tradition, in the Nyingma tradition, is that there's never a pejorative or looking down upon Theravada Buddhism or like more foundational teachings of Buddhism, because they're all what's necessary for someone. That teaching is going to be what connects to some people the best. And Mahayana Buddhism, if they heard Mahayana Buddhism, they might think, I'm not even interested in Buddhism, I don't think, because they're talking crazy stuff. But I can get down with this, like, I'm going to free myself stuff. This free all being stuff sounds like crazy. I'm drowning in suffering. I can't think about other people, like, on that level. And there are other reasons. This is just a simple example, but all teachings are legit. All teachings are now or ultimately down the road an authentic path to enlightenment. All the teachings of the Buddha are stages of progress that are useful to a particular person at a particular level in their own progress. So, at any rate, what the Buddha was teaching in the Heart Sutra is what we would call definitive teaching, meaning it is literally what the Buddha experienced when he got enlightened. And it is the view, we use the word view in Buddhism a lot. It is the view of reality that is like the real heart of Mahayana Buddhism, because it is this view of emptiness that gets you liberated. Like I said before, generosity, compassion, they will help you get to the point where you can develop the view, but they directly will not get you enlightened. It is the view of emptiness, this view of reality, that will generate or will free you from suffering, will generate this experience of enlightenment. And then one last little thing that I want to say here before we wrap up is that yes, I talked about meditation and that this is what someone will see when they meditate and so forth, in that state of meditative concentration, like a noble being. But we'll come to this in the sutra later, but when we get into the main sutra. But one thing that you should know here is that this sutra is also not exactly the teaching of the Buddha. It is, but it's actually a conversation between two of the Buddha's students. And when we talk in Buddhism, there are three types of what we call Buddhist scripture. There's one that's called from the mouth of the Buddha. There's one that's called by the blessing of the Buddha. And there's one that's called with permission by the Buddha. So with permission by the Buddha is like, for example, they'll say, at one time the Buddha was resting in Rajgir at the Vulture's Peak mountain with a great congregation of bodhisattvas and a great congregation of monastics. And at one time, and at that time, this is thus I have heard. This is what I heard, something like that. And at the very end, they'll say, and then all the people who were in attendance were very happy and they praised the Buddha and this and that. Those are things the Buddha said that they could put into the sutra, but the Buddha didn't say those things. The Buddha didn't say at one time the Blessed One was in Rajgir at Vulture's Peak, blah, 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 blah. But the Buddha told them that for context, when they collected the teachings of the Buddha, that they could include those kind of things to add context. So like, where was the teaching, who was there, that kind of stuff. Then the third one, teaching by the blessing of the Buddha. We'll find out later in the sutra, but the way the sutra starts is the Buddha's meditating. He's not talking. And then it says, by the power of the Buddha, or by the blessing of the Buddha, then, Avalokiteshvara started like kind of looking at emptiness or something like that. And then through that, Shariputra asked him a question. How should someone who wants to practice, how should they experience emptiness, something like that? So he says, the verb that he used is not how should someone meditate on emptiness. He said, how should someone, in this version of the translation of 84,000, they translated the word as practice. But that same word could mean even experience, or how should one act in accordance with emptiness, something like that. So that's an important point. I'm also in this follow-up email leaving you with a series of, for those of you who really want to go for it, there's a series of like maybe 9 hour-ish long lectures by Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche on the Heart Sutra. And in that, he really emphasizes this point because he says it's not explicitly about meditation. It's like that you should actually try through your practice of meditation eventually to see everything that way and experience everything that way. Like when you're eating food, when you're driving your car, when you're doing things, it's not a thing that you just meditate and try and see emptiness and then leave it at the door when you go out the door to do your rest of your life. So he didn't ask, how do you meditate on emptiness? He's like, how should I experience the world through this experience of emptiness? Something like that. So that's an important thing to remember when you start going deeper and exploring this teaching of emptiness and the Heart Sutra and so forth, that it's not isolated to something that you can do in your house with the doors closed, in your nice little space, but it's like the point of it, yes, that might be necessary to gain some experience through that first so that you can apply it in your day-to-day life, but the idea is that ultimately we start to learn to apply this throughout our experience.